Hi everyone, welcome back to our Histo-PH family, where forgotten Filipino history finally comes alive. Today, we're diving deep into before Spain and America, the Sultanate of Sulu ruled the seas. A story that rewrites everything we thought we knew about our beginnings. Imagine a kingdom so powerful that European empires trembled at its name. A sultanate that commanded fleets of warships, controlled the richest trade routes in Asia, and built an empire that lasted over 4 centuries. This wasn't in the Middle East or the Mediterranean. This was in Southeast Asia, on islands most people have never heard of. The Sultanate of Sulu was once the undisputed master of the seas, a maritime superpower that Spain couldn't conquer and America struggled to subdue. Yet today, most history books barely mention it. This is the untold story of one of the greatest forgotten empires in history. The rise of a maritime empire. Long before Magellan's ships limped into Philippine waters in 1521, the Sultanate of Sulu was already a thriving empire. Founded in 1405 by Sharif ul-Hashim, a Muslim missionary from the Middle East, Sulu wasn't just another petty kingdom. It was a sophisticated state built on naval supremacy, trade networks, and strategic alliances that stretched from China to Java. The Sulu archipelago was perfectly positioned. Nestled between the Philippine Islands and Borneo, it sat at the crossroads of the most valuable trade routes in Asia. Chinese junks heading south, Javanese vessels sailing north, and traders from across the Malay world all had to pass through Sulu waters, and the sultans made sure they paid for the privilege. Masters of the sea. What made Sulu truly formidable was its navy. The Tausug people, the dominant ethnic group of Sulu, were born sailors. Their warships, called Vinta and Garai, were engineering marvels. Fast, maneuverable, and armed with brass cannons acquired through trade with Europeans and Chinese, these vessels could outrun and outfight almost anything on the water. But Sulu's real weapon was the Balangingi and Iranan raiders. These were professional maritime warriors who operated under the Sultan's authority. They weren't just pirates, though Spanish and American sources would paint them that way. They were the Sultan's navy, conducting sanctioned raids, protecting trade routes, and projecting Sulu power across thousands of miles of ocean. At its peak in the 18th century, Sulu controlled an empire that spanned from Palawan to North Borneo, from Mindanao to parts of Sulawesi. Their raiding fleets could strike targets as far away as the coast of Luzon, where Spanish colonial settlements cowered behind walls. Spanish galleons had to travel in armed convoys, and even then, they weren't safe. The economy of empire. Sulu wasn't just about military might. It was rich, incredibly rich. The Sultanate controlled the trade in birds' nests, pearls, sea cucumbers, and most importantly, the exotic products from the interior of Borneo. Camphor, rattan, and forest products flowed through Sulu ports to eager Chinese merchants who paid in silver, silk, and porcelain. The sultans also controlled the slave trade, a dark but economically crucial part of their empire. Captives from raids were integrated into Sulu society as laborers, pearl divers, and eventually, many became part of the community itself. This wasn't chattel slavery as practiced in the Americas, but a complex system where slaves could own property, marry, and even achieve positions of status. The capital, Jolo, was a cosmopolitan hub. Arab traders, Chinese merchants, Malay seafarers, and even European adventurers walked its streets. The Sultan's palace was filled with treasures, from across Asia, proof of Sulu's far-reaching connections. If you're amazed by our ancestors' story, before Spain and America, the Sultanate of Sulu ruled the seas. Help us hit our 500-like goal. Drop a comment about your favorite fact and subscribe to join the Histo-PH family. And don't forget to hype this video. Spain's futile centuries. When Spain colonized the Philippines in 1565, they expected to bring all the islands under their control. They were wrong. For over 300 years, Spain threw expedition after expedition at Sulu. Every single one failed. The Spanish built forts, sent armadas, and launched what they called holy wars against the Moro pirates, their derogatory term for Muslim Filipinos. The Sultans of Sulu responded with devastating counter-raids. Spanish towns on Luzon and the Visayas were burned, thousands were captured, and Spain's prestige took hit after hit. In 1578, a massive Spanish expedition captured Jolo and burned the Sultan's palace. Victory seemed assured, but the Sultan simply retreated into the interior, launched guerrilla attacks, and within months, the Spanish were forced to withdraw. This pattern repeated itself for centuries. Spain could win battles, but never the war. The sultans were brilliant strategists. They played European powers against each other, signing treaties with the Dutch and British when convenient, then breaking them when necessary. They modernized their arsenals with European weapons, hired foreign military advisors, and adapted their tactics to counter Spanish technology. The treaty nobody remembers. Here's something that will blow your mind. In 1836, Sultan Muhammad Jamalul Alam signed a treaty with the United States, making Sulu one of the first Asian states to establish diplomatic relations with America. The Sultan was looking for allies against Spain, and the Americans, eager for trade opportunities in Asia, were happy to oblige. This treaty recognized Sulu as a sovereign nation. American merchants received special trading privileges, and for a brief period, the Stars and Stripes flew alongside Sulu's royal banner in Jolo. The United States officially recognized Sulu's independence decades before it became a colonial power in the Philippines. The Spanish-American War and Betrayal. Everything changed in 1898. Spain, defeated by the United States in a quick, brutal war, sold the Philippines to America for $20 million through the Treaty of Paris. There was just one problem. Spain didn't actually control Sulu. The Sultanate was still independent, still sovereign, and still armed. The Tausug people were outraged. How could Spain sell something it didn't own? The Sultan protested, citing the 1836 treaty with America. Surely the United States, which had recognized Sulu's sovereignty, wouldn't participate in this betrayal. They would. America wanted the Philippines, all of it, and Sulu's strategic position was too valuable to ignore. The rich waters, the control over shipping lanes to Borneo and the Celebes, the potential for economic exploitation, it was all too tempting. The Moro Rebellion. What followed was one of the most brutal colonial conflicts in American history, though it's rarely taught in schools. From 1899 to 1913, Sulu and other Muslim sultanates fought the American occupation in what became known as the Moro Rebellion. The Tausug warriors fought with incredible bravery, armed with kris swords, spears, and whatever firearms they could acquire. They faced American soldiers equipped with artillery, machine guns, and the latest military technology. The Americans responded with overwhelming force. The Battle of Budejo in 1906 is a scar on American history. Nearly 1,000 Tausug people, including women and children, fortified themselves in the crater of an extinct volcano, refusing to surrender. American forces surrounded the crater and opened fire with artillery and rifles. When it was over, only 6 people survived. Even American officers were horrified by what had happened, but the news was barely reported back home. Sultan Jamalul Kiram II tried to negotiate, to find a path that would preserve some autonomy for his people. In 1915, he signed an agreement that officially ended Sulu's sovereignty in exchange for American recognition of Islamic law and customs in Sulu. The Sultanate was allowed to continue in a ceremonial role, but its real power was gone. The legacy: today, the Sultanate of Sulu exists in a strange limbo. The royal family still exists, still claims the throne, and is still recognized by many Tausug people as their legitimate rulers. The current sultan lives in relative obscurity, a reminder of a glorious past that most of the world has forgotten. But the impact of Sulu's empire remains. The Tausug language, culture, and traditions survive. Islamic practices in the region trace their roots directly to the Sultanate's centuries of rule. And the territorial disputes over parts of Borneo? Those stem from ancient Sulu claims that predate any colonial boundary. In Malaysia, the descendants of the Sulu sultans still receive annual payments for the lease of Sabah, an arrangement that dates back to 1878, when the Sultan leased the territory to a British company. That's right. A dead sultanate still collects rent on territory it lost over a century ago. Why this matters? The story of Sulu forces us to reconsider everything we think we know about colonialism and resistance. This wasn't a primitive society swept aside by European progress. This was a sophisticated empire with its own ships, cannons, diplomatic corps, and international treaties. They held off Spain for 3 centuries and only fell to America after a brutal war that the US government tried to hide from its own citizens. The Sultanate of Sulu ruled the seas when most of the Americas were still being explored. It was conducting international diplomacy when many European nations were still forming. It had a navy that commanded respect across Asia when Britain was just beginning to dream of maritime supremacy. Yet this empire, this incredible story of resistance, innovation, and resilience is barely a footnote in most history books. Why? The weapons that terrified empires. Let's talk about what made Sulu's military so devastating. The Sultanate didn't just rely on traditional weapons, they were master innovators who adapted and improved everything they captured or traded for. The Lantaka, a bronze swivel cannon, became Sulu's signature weapon. These weren't crude copies of European guns. Sulu craftsmen, working with techniques learned from Chinese and Malay metallurgists, created weapons that were lighter, more reliable, and perfectly suited for naval warfare. A single vinter could carry multiple Lantaka, turning small, fast boats into floating artillery platforms that could devastate larger, slower Spanish galleons. But the real terror weapon was the Tausug warrior himself. Spanish accounts describe them with a mixture of fear and grudging respect. These warriors practiced a tradition called Parang Sabil, a form of jihad where fighters would take an oath to fight to the death. Once sworn, they would attack with such ferocity that Spanish soldiers coined a term we still use today: running amok. The English word amok comes directly from the Malay amuk, describing the unstoppable fighting style of these warriors. The Americans faced the same problem. Standard issue .38 caliber revolvers couldn't stop charging Tausug warriors. The Americans had to develop the .45 caliber pistol specifically for the Moro conflicts. The legendary Colt 1911, one of the most famous handguns in history, exists because American soldiers needed more stopping power against Sulu's fighters. That's how formidable these warriors were. They forced the US military to redesign their weapons. The diplomatic chess masters. The sultans weren't just warriors, they were cunning diplomats who played global politics like grandmasters. Sultan Kudarat, who ruled in the 17th century, is legendary for his political acumen. He formed alliances with the Dutch East India Company, used them to acquire advanced weapons, then turned around and negotiated with the Spanish when it suited him. The Sultanate maintained relationships with the Ottoman Empire, claiming spiritual connection to the Caliphate in Constantinople. This wasn't just symbolic. Ottoman support lent legitimacy and occasionally provided military advisors who brought knowledge of the latest military techniques from conflicts in Europe and the Middle East.